We are starting meeting number 44. I want to welcome everyone to it. Our chair is indisposed in sunnier climes than where we are right now on a parliamentary trip. So we are continuing on with our Arctic study, Arctic security, that we started back on October 6th with a motion under Standing Order 1082. Joining us today, no strangers to this committee, Jody Thomas, former Deputy Minister of National Defence, now the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. She's joined by Jordan Zed, who is the Interim Foreign and Defence Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister, and Mike MacDonald, the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet on Security and Intelligence. Welcome, all of you. Ms. Thomas, Madam Thomas, I invite you to lead off with your opening comments. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's nice to be back at the National Defence Committee. I'm Jody Thomas, as the Chair said, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. In this role, I provide advice and information to the Prime Minister on issues related to foreign affairs, defence, security, and intelligence. This includes situational awareness and advice on a range of issues, both strategic and operational. I work with officials across government to coordinate and advance a diverse range of activities related to these topics. And so many of the files that I deal with touch on the Arctic and decisions related to a dynamic region that can have serious domestic and foreign policy implications. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to contribute to this important study on Arctic security, which comes at a critical time. Comme vous le savez, l'Arctique compose.
As you're all aware, the Arctic comprises over 40% of Canada's territory and over 75% of its national coastlines. It's a complex and challenging environment with a harsh climate, large areas, sparse population, limited physical and digital infrastructure, and high operating costs. The Arctic is fundamental to both Canada's identity and its sovereignty. It's also an area of high interest for allies and adversaries. Rapid and enduring climate change is making the region more accessible for navigation.
Les nouvelles technologies.
New commercial and military technologies are connecting the North to the rest of the world and eroding the region's historical isolation from geopolitical affairs. This, of course, has far-reaching implications for the future of the Arctic.
The invasion of Ukraine has halted nearly all Western cooperation with the largest Arctic state. This has complicated the important work of the Arctic Council, which is currently under Russian chairmanship until spring 2023, when it will pass to Norway. With the pending accession of Finland and Sweden, 7 of 8 Arctic states will be NATO allies. Canada and like-minded Arctic states continue to promote a low-tension vision for the region. Though this vision is increasingly complicated by current geopolitical frictions, strategic competition, and an ever-growing number of states, both friendly and adversarial, seeking access and influence. While Canada continues to see no immediate threat of military attack to the Canadian Arctic, the Arctic region generally is seen by Canada and its allies as a theatre of competition and potential instability, if not closely managed by Canada and like-minded Arctic states. The rapid evolving strategic context underscores the importance of effective safety and security frameworks, strong alliances, and credible deterrence. Climate change remains the most prominent and visible threat to the Arctic and all its inhabitants, with warming recorded at 4 times the global average, leading to melting ice, rapid coastal erosion, increased precipitation, permafrost degradation, crumbling infrastructure, and invasive species migration. Environmental changes are profoundly impacting the health and well-being of Northerners, traditional ways of life, and Northern infrastructure, including critical defense installations. Adversarial states are increasingly active in the region, and they are building Arctic-capable military equipment with the goal of seeking to secure control over strategic assets and resources. They are also looking to make economic investments, which could be leveraged for coercive effect. The Arctic remains a strategically important region for continental defense as the North continues to present a potential avenue of access or attack. Rapid technological changes, including in cruise missile and hypersonic technology, the rise of competition in new domains such as space, emerging technologies, and cyber, are impacting the way states pursue their interests. These changes also enhance their ability to project military force in the Arctic and hold North America at risk. As maritime navigation continues to increase over the coming years and decades, Canada must prepare to meet growing demands on national capabilities and infrastructure. These include supporting civilian authorities in response to domestic emergencies, ensuring safety of navigation, including port infrastructure, maintaining all domain awareness of the Arctic environment, enforcing Canadian laws and regulations throughout the region, being prepared to respond to more frequent search and rescue operations. Given the current attacks on the international rules-based order by some nations, Canada and like-minded Arctic states will need to work closely together to ensure Arctic tensions are responsibly managed. Circumpolar collaboration and cooperation between the Arctic states will be essential to achieving such a partnership. Canada's approach will continue to emphasize the need to minimize and manage tensions in the Arctic by, first and foremost, working closely and collectively and bilaterally with like-minded Arctic partners. Les États-Unis demeurent le principal.
The United States remains Canada's premier Arctic partner. This strong relationship, underscored by NORAD, will continue to stand as vital to the defence of the North American Arctic. Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework also aligns well with the US's approach to the region.
Arctic state, Canada is looked upon to be a leader in Arctic issues. It is critical that Canada continues to prepare for increased international activity in the region, to defend Arctic sovereignty, and to ensure the safety and security of the Canadian Arctic inhabitants. This is key to ensuring our sovereignty and our continued ability to meet our commitments for the defence of the continent. Strengthening Canada's defence and security posture in the Arctic will also ensure Canada is recognized by the United States and other allies as assuming its security and defence responsibility, an important part of our strategic credibility. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I look forward to answering questions.
We're going to move on to our first round, and Ms. Glant, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. China considers itself to be a near-Arctic nation, and the Five Eyes have warned our government about the security threat it poses. As NSA to the Prime Minister, why would the RCMP, or why was that contract let without a national security review being done? And I'm referring to the contract to build for the RCMP an RF system.
Touch it. Thank you for the question. So, number one, I think that we need to stop referring to China and its aspirations to be a near Arctic state in that term. That's their term. It's not ours, and we should not use it. There is no such thing as a near Arctic state. You are either an Arctic state or you are not. And so that's a personal opinion of mine, and it's just something I think we should emphasize. In terms of the particular RFP that you have referenced, it is premature for me to speak to what occurred in that procurement. It began over a year ago. I think it is critical that as we review and update procurement policies, we understand the threat vectors coming at us, that we do ensure that the safety parameters are in RFPs and that we determine the kind of technology and where it comes from in our procurements. And so that is the work ahead, and the Prime Minister has promised a complete review.
So let's talk about technology, because the CPP does consider itself a near-Arctic nation, and it has a permanent presence there. And they're eager to exploit our rare earth elements and make no secret of preferring a liberal government over a conservative because they seem apparently more compliant. CSIS reported on political interference earlier this year, and as NSA advisor to the Prime Minister, I'd like to know why he wasn't advised about the political interference on that CSIS report.
Thank you very much for the question. So China may consider itself a near-Arctic state. We do not. They don't have a permanent presence in the Arctic. They certainly have periodic and episodic and seasonal presence in the Arctic. And they are working with Russia where it's useful to them to increase their presence in the Arctic. Their interest in critical minerals is known, and that is something that we, as one of the countries richest in critical minerals, have to be very aware of.
the Prime Minister must have known something about the political interference allegations in the 2019 and 21 elections, because he raised the issues, or he claimed to raise the issues with President Xi when he was overseas, and President Xi was quite upset about this. So was it you who advised him, or was it you about the reports of the political interference for those elections, or was it you that shielded him from knowing about the CSIS report?
Well, not being in this job during the 2019 election, I did not advise the Prime Minister on foreign interference at that time. I have briefed the Prime Minister since on foreign interference, along with my CSIS colleague. The Prime Minister is briefed regularly, and foreign interference is not just an election cycle issue. It is a constant, and it is something we are constantly vigilant about, and that we keep the Prime Minister informed where we see vectors of foreign interference in this country on any number of
So the CSIS report came earlier this year, and you were NSA advisor at that time. So why wasn't he advised when the report came out from CSIS? And when did he actually find out about this report and the contents?
You would have to reference the specific report.
The specific report is the report that the CSIS provided that came out in the news recently on the election interference in 2019 and 2021.
So there is a news report on election interference. There is not necessarily a CSIS report that equates to that news report. The Prime Minister has been thoroughly briefed.
When was he first thoroughly briefed?
I can't speak to when he has first been briefed on foreign interference. He was briefed as recently as 2 weeks ago on foreign interference in general.
And that's the earliest you're aware of him being...
No, I said as recently as 2 weeks ago, and he has been briefed since he has been Prime Minister on foreign interference.
Thank you. During the visit to Ottawa by the Freedom Convoy earlier this year, a spy plane was flying surveillance pattern. Were they scanning for the presence of the near Arctic nation China considers itself to be for political interference in that?
I think that D&D would be best placed to answer that question, but the short answer is no. It was a training mission. It should not have been flying at that time.
So it should not have been flying, but if it wasn't scanning for foreign interference, because that's what the allegation was as the motivation behind this convoy, then perhaps they were obviously looking at the crowd faces to identify military members. How many members in the military did that spy plane identify?
So you are making assertions here that are not accurate. It was a training mission. It wasn't looking for foreign interference. The convoy was not motivated by foreign interference. It was domestic, ideologically motivated extremism and anger about COVID restrictions. So I don't think that we should conflate issues.
So we're going to be approximately a decade short in having satellite surveillance in the Arctic. What are you going to suggest to the Prime Minister with respect to ensuring there is not interference or components that come from China, who considers itself to be a near Arctic nation?
And then you're just out of time there. If you can just provide a very brief answer, Ms. Thomas.
The security of the satellites that Canada puts in orbit is highly managed by both the private sector partners and PSPC, and certainly the Canadian Space Agency.
Thank you. Ms. Lambropoulos, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Ms. Thomas for being here with us to answer some of our questions today. My first question to you is about the role that foreign actors play in Canada, how concerned we should be, and what is Canada currently doing in order to counter this? What are we doing in order to monitor foreign activities, especially in the Arctic, but even more broadly across the country?
Thank you very much for the question. colleagues from Public Safety and Minister Mendicino, certainly along with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense, have spoken to the work being done to ensure that there is no foreign influence and interference in Canada. It is a universal problem. All of our Five Eyes allies are facing the same issues in terms of foreign interference. So the hostile activity of state actors is being examined and monitored. We're doing some public consultation now to look at a foreign agent registry, as well as vigilance in terms of our IT systems through the the Communication Security Establishment, and working with CSIS in terms of knowing who's a foreign and threat actor in this country. Foreign interference and foreign influence is a constant cycle of activity. And yes, there are particular threat vectors and particular issues that foreign actors would be interested in, but asserting their country's position on specific issues and trying to influence certain individuals, it's an age-old problem. It's become advanced in terms of the technology that is now used, and certainly social media has advanced that. Misinformation, disinformation are key tools of foreign threat actors, where they attempt to use disinformation to influence the Canadian population.
Thank you. And we know that both Russia and China are quite good at this kind of foreign interference, and they have cyber capabilities that we should be wary of and that we should be defending our country against. So what are some of the ways that our adversaries' cyber abilities influence the way that we prepare ourselves, and in what ways have we made investments in technologies that would counter these kind of cyber abilities?
Thank you for that question. As I think you know, the Communication Security Establishment is a jewel in the Canadian crown in terms of keeping our cyber networks safe from the interference, influence, and disruption that can be caused by foreign threat actors. What we have to do as a society is start to look very differently and at misinformation and disinformation and how that is used to influence the population. Free speech is, of course, a right. But when we identify something as being blatantly disinformation, which is deliberately placing information that is untrue, as opposed to misinformation, which is the propagation of that information unwittingly, we have to take it down. We have to address the issues. And that gets difficult because of the social media platforms, but it is something that we are examining actively. And I don't know, Mr. McDonald, if you'd like to add.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very quick. I think there was four points I'd like to make in addition. One is key to efforts in dealing with cyber and cyber activities is understanding the motivations of those who are your adversaries, and there's dedicated work in this area. Next is the skill sets of the people, people that work in this area, ensuring you have the right individuals and you grow cyber experts in your labor force and your work markets. Lastly is really to advocate cyber hygiene. Get out and educate people, talk to people about what it really means to click a button. And the last is partnerships, and partnerships on all levels between governments, private companies, businesses, civil society, advocates, and everyone. You can have a lot of effect if you have strong partnerships. Thank you.
So on that point, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'm assuming I have at least a minute. On that point, can you speak to us about what role our allies can play in defending ourselves against these cyber threats as well? Is there a way that we can work with our allies in order to have a more of a united front against these types of threats?
The question, that's a very important question. We are working with our Five Eyes allies constantly in terms of sharing intelligence about foreign threats and foreign interference. The G7 has taken an interest in this phenomena, and Global Affairs Canada has a group called the RRM that looks at interference from other nations in terms of misinformation and disinformation, which I think is really critical, highlights it and reports back to the G7 body, and action is taken in some cases. I think that the Western world, a world that believes in the rules-based order, has to call out this interference as we see it. And we do that better when we do it as a unified group than if we do it as each individual countries. And I think that it's a very powerful message when the G7 or the G20 calls out that kind of foreign interference when we see it.
Thank you. Mr. Bazan, how much time do I have left?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, so I'm not going to try to stick a question in here because you won't be able to answer me, but I just want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Désolé, 6 minutes.
6 minutes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and welcome to our guests today. Welcome to my colleagues as well, of course. Ms. Thomas, in your opinion, the fact that polar ice-breaking shipbuilding yards have been awarded to 2 different companies, well, is this just about politics, or if not, is there an impact of that decision regardless?
Thank you for the question. Icebreaking and icebreakers are very near and dear to my heart, going back to my Coast Guard days. That 2 companies have been provided contracts means that the Coast Guard will get ships faster, and that is the bottom line. The impact of it is that the throughput of refit, renovation, rebuilt, and brand new ships for the Coast Guard will reach the Coast Guard, the operators, and the client base sooner. And so the National Shipbuilding Strategy is very high profile, there's no doubt, but the positive impact of what has occurred with awarding contracts to the 3rd shipyard is that the Coast Guard fleet will be renewed much more quickly.
What do you mean when you say more quickly? Is there any changes to what has been slated in terms of the delivery schedule?
The original National Shipbuilding Strategy awarded all of the Coast Guard ships to Vancouver Shipyard. With the recent announcement of Coast Guard receiving Davie Shipyard receiving some contracts, means that we will not be waiting for a ship-a-year kind of approach out of Vancouver, which isn't a criticism of Vancouver, that's the capacity. It means there will be an inject of additional ships from Davie.
Now, if the Louis Saint-Laurent is no longer operational, what are you going to do before the new icebreakers arrive in that case?
Well, thank you for the question. I am no longer the Commissioner of the Canadian Coast Guard, and so he is best placed to answer that question. There will have to be workarounds. There are icebreakers that are available for lease. They will look at whether they can extend the life of the Louis. She is an old ship, but she's extremely well built, and so they'll have to see if there is a refit that can be done that provides good value for money in order to extend her life as we await the polar icebreakers.
Well, based on the information that we have gotten, from 2023, it wouldn't normally be in good usage, but this usage might be extended and pushed out. It's quite expensive to maintain an icebreaker for 7 years, keep it afloat. There are major costs associated. Can we evaluate the costs of refitting such an icebreaker?
Thank you very much for that question. That work is being done now within PSPC and within the Canadian Coast Guard to analyze the value for money, as I said, of completing a refit. And some of it will be, you do a refit, it gives you 2 or 3 more years, significant money, but you have to look at what you lose without that icebreaker. Between the icebreaking capacity of the Louis Saint-Laurent and the science capacity, there would be significant loss to the continuity of science research in the Arctic and continuity of icebreaking. And so that's the work that they are doing now. I'm no longer actually in this role involved with the National Shipbuilding Strategy.
But you're talking there about 2 or 3 years, but will have to extend its life over a 7-year period. Is this even possible or realistic?
As I said, I'm not current on the state of the Louis Saint-Laurent, but you would get advice from the Canadian Coast Guard Commissioner on that, and that work is being done.
The Louis Saint-Laurent isn't the only icebreaker in that particular situation. is there a cost-benefit ratio that's been determined if over a 7-year period there's a refit on an icebreaker vis-a-vis a new icebreaker? I don't know what the costs are of refits like that, but isn't it disproportionate? Isn't it far too expensive as opposed to buying a new one?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the ongoing cost of refitting old ships, it is expensive. There's no doubt. They're harder to refit, harder to get parts for. You find more metal fatigue. You find problems that you had not anticipated when you open up a ship like that for a refit. It becomes a question of what do you lose if you don't do it. And so there's a capacity loss that has to be weighed against the investment made. Buying new, though, is a long process. That's the concern.
Madame Thomas, si vous êtes...
Ms. Thomas, if you had a magic wand, we know that there's politics here. One government's in power, then there's a new government in power. If you had a magic wand, what would the solution be? Because I get the sense that we're going to be coming to grips with the very same problems in 10 years' time. What would you do? Speak freely.
I would do a number of things with it, but in the particular case of procurement, both for national defence, the Canadian Armed Forces, and for the Coast Guard, I would like to see a cyclical plan of procurement. You finish one. Number one, the Coast Guard's never had a class of ships built for them. They've had ships added in, old ships refitted. So they're now, for the first time in the 65-year history of the Coast Guard, getting a class of ships that are built for purpose, built for them. That's very positive. The Canadian Armed Forces are equally, the surface combatant is being built for them. I would like to see a process in this country where it is evergreen procurement. The surface combatant, you're halfway through building one fleet and you move on to start planning the next one so that you're not keeping ships in operation for 30, 35 years and then starting to look at the next procurement. It is complex, it is expensive, but I think as a nation with the largest coastline in the world, a huge land mass, keeping military equipment, Coast Guard equipment, major procurement as a evergreen, economically responsible program is a really critical move forward. So if I had a magic wand on that front, that is what I would do.
I'm going to cut it off there.
Yes, Madame Thomas.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas.
Ms. Matheson, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much for joining us today. In terms of that conversation, I mean, you talked about the role, of course, of foreign state actors and that compared to the other issues that certainly the Arctic is dealing with. We have heard a lot within this committee, of course, though, that it's a lot of this idea of potential threat, right, is just that there's a lot of guessing games that have to go on. And you certainly have to be prepared for that. Our security overall has to be prepared for that. But what kind of data do you specifically, and I know that you can't tell us specifics, but what have you seen to solidify that against the idea that we have also heard in this committee that says Russia isn't going to come on Arctic soil. Russia or China, they're not going to invade Canada. Can you talk about the more specifics or the hardline evidence that you see generally?
I can in general terms. And
Okay.
Thank you. I think it's a really important conversation. I think there's some data points that we can look at. Russia is rebuilding its Arctic military infrastructure to Soviet era capability. And they had stopped and they're returning. I think that's interesting. They are continuing their construction in the Arctic despite the economic woes they are experiencing as a result of their illegal and barbaric invasion of Ukraine. They're continuing to invest in the Arctic. I think that's an interesting data point. Their military doctrine indicates when they would use and how they would use their equipment from the Arctic, and we see them exercising it. That's another data point. They are playing a long game, and so is China. They don't have a partnership with China at all. We don't see them as collaborating with China, but they cooperate when it is each to their own advantage. I think that is another data point. China's interest in rare earth minerals and hydrocarbons in our Arctic, and their interest in being able to navigate through the Arctic, so their construction of icebreakers when they do not have ice-covered waters that require icebreakers of the size and capacity they're building, is another data point. And so at one point, 2 and 2 equals 4, or you can make 2 and 2 equal 3. And we have decided that 2 and 2 equals 4. There is no imminent threat. We agree with all of the analysis, the intelligence, the military view. That said, everything I've described is not happening in a vacuum. We have to be aware, and we have to understand it.
So, I mean, we could argue the same, right? So we are investing in icebreakers. We are investing in commercial and natural resource capacity in our north. We align ourselves with other state actors at our convenience. Why is that so dramatically different?
Their intent. China has made it very clear what their intent is with the Belt and Road Initiative, and certainly with the Polar Silk Road, I believe it is called. So you can look at the Belt and Road Initiative and see the check marks down the list of things they're doing. There's no reason to presume they're not doing the same with their Arctic intentions.
Okay. One of the other things that you had mentioned, of course, is that climate change perspective, of course. And we have this huge gap. We're going to be hearing from the Auditor General shortly about this procurement gap, what we haven't been planning for the last decade, where we need to be, but the immediate threat that is climate change. So how do you make sure that that's constantly part of your plans? What do you consult in terms of that climate change risk? What's the comparison in terms of that and other national security risks? What's that?
As I think the Chief of Defense Staff has said here, climate change is an existential risk. It is causing drought. Wars are being fought over access to water. It is causing the world's major protein source, fish, to move further north and away from populations that need it, and causing more illegal fishing, which causes economic harm. So there are a number of things that are not purely military that add to our risk assessment when we talk about climate change. In terms of the Arctic, we know it is warming faster than the rest of the globe. That means that the opportunities to access hydrocarbons appear to be more, that hydrocarbons, rare earth minerals, things that are of interest are more accessible. They're in fact more dangerous in the midterm. I think the Coast Guard has probably told you about their concern about as the ice melts, multi-year ice comes down from the polar cap and is in the navigable waters. It's much more dangerous for navigation. The Arctic is not charted to modern standards. It doesn't have aids to navigation to modern standards. So the consequence of that, if something goes wrong, is significant. A ship going aground and the ecological disaster that could occur from that. And so we have to be prepared for it. In the immediate, there's that kind of a risk as opposed to a military risk.
So in terms of that illegal fishing, that commercial value, we certainly are seeing that with the state actors going in that route, our own, the need for more search and rescue. It sort of plays into this idea, though, that we had been discussing before in this study as well, that those are policing issues, that is determined by international law, not necessarily in that military sense. So, but it also relies upon us having very, very strong alliances, as you had mentioned, with other international partners in that sort of multilateral forum. So, and I think about, you had mentioned the role of the Arctic Council. And so that further pushing away of Russia within that Arctic Council, within that them seeing themselves as a major Arctic player, how do you see that in terms of a... I heard that.
Kind of wrap that up.
How do you see that in terms of a larger problem
and Ms. Thomas, I'm asking
how we
you
solve that?
to be like question period here, so under 30 seconds if you can. I know it's a lot to unpack.
So that was a lot of preamble.
I would say very quickly that Russia doesn't get to choose the parts of the rules-based order it wants to participate in. And they have eliminated themselves for the moment from discussions because they have not proven themselves to be a trustworthy member of the rules-based order, and they need to come to the table and account for what they've done in Ukraine. That said, many multilateral fora go on. Arctic Council is under discussion. It's moving to Norway in terms of the chairmanship. A really critical element in terms of safety in the Arctic is the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And that was begun in 2000, I want to say 15-ish, where Arctic Coast Guards are talking about ecology, policing, safety,
Okay, I'm
search
going to have to
and
cut you off
rescue.
there. Sorry about that. Got to be judicious. So we're going to go to our second round, 5 minutes for everyone. Well, not for everyone, but we'll start with Ms. Cramp Ewan for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Thomas, were you ever briefed or informed in any capacity about foreign or potential foreign interference in any Canadian electoral process by China or any foreign actor? And if yes, did you relay this to the Prime Minister? And if not, why not?
Thank you. Yeah, I briefed the Prime Minister on intelligence constantly, and certainly on foreign interference. As I said, I was not in this job, and I was not a part of the panel of 5 in the election oversight committee for the 2019 election or the 2021 election. The news stories that you have read about interference are just that, news stories. We have not seen, if I'll just say it, we've not seen money going to 11 candidates, period.
Thank you. Earlier today, you mentioned that we would need to reference a specific CSIS report. Could you possibly let us know if there is a report on 2019 or 2021 foreign election interference? And if so, when was it published? And if there was a title, could you share it? And did you brief the Prime Minister on it? Yes or no?
Again, CSIS reports constantly, and so I can't give you a title of a specific report. It'd certainly be heavily redacted if there were one, and I wouldn't be able to speak about it here. CSIS, there are several oversight mechanisms to ensure safe elections. There is a technical committee called SITE. Mike is a member of that, in fact, co-chairs it, and he can speak to you about that.
Okay, thank you. If I can just move on to the next question. So we've learned, of course, that the Liberal government has awarded a contract to a company with ties to China to secure counter-espionage technology. In my opinion, government seems to be pretending to do a complete 180 with China. So how is it possibly a good idea to give a company accused of espionage control of our anti-espionage technology?
Thank you for the question. As I said, we are looking into what happened with that contract now. It was awarded a year ago, or the RFP process was started about a year ago. The IPS that has just come out has been very clear about our position, the government's position on China. However, the terms of reference for the review we're doing is we're just creating them. I'm still gathering information from the departments involved.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Madam Thomas, when you took on this job, were you briefed on foreign electoral interference when you came on for this job?
Thank you. I started this job in January 11th, 2022. I had a series of briefings. Foreign electoral interference was not one of the first ones. Certainly, it has occurred, but the public reporting that you've seen indicates there was no interference that affected the outcome of the election. There's constant misinformation and disinformation. There are people putting out information constantly about elections and about individuals and about your party's platform, other parties' platforms. That's how this happens in the world we live in today. There was no interference that affected the election outcome.
Okay, thank you. Madam Thomas, the Chinese government currently owns approximately 10% of Hystera Communications through an investment fund, and Hystera is being investigated by U.S. for espionage. Have you advised the Prime Minister and the RCMP about Hystera?
I have not.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so perhaps a little bit more direct. Do you feel as though you're currently shielding the Prime Minister?
Again, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, point of order. I think that's we've been very patient with the relevance of the questions from the opposition. This is a study on the Arctic.
With all due respect.
And excuse me. And I just ask respectfully that we get back to the study of the Arctic. Thank you.
I'll just say this, that because this has been discussed at this meeting, it is relevant to the meeting because it has been, Ms. Thomas has been answering the questions. So I'll allow the questioning to continue, especially in light of the fact that we do see China as a threat to our Arctic security. Ms. Cramp-Newman.
I'm willing to answer
The question was not about Arctic security, Mr. Chair.
But it's relevant to the meeting that we're having
It
because
is not.
I've ruled that this is in order and we'll continue on. You have a minute and a half left, Mr. Cramp-Newman. Order.
I would like to answer that question.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Thomas.
I'm not sure that my personal integrity needs to be attacked in this committee. I am not shielding the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is briefed regularly. He's very interested in this subject. He has directed work for agencies to do, but it's not to imply that bureaucrats and officials, deputy ministers, agency heads are shielding the Prime Minister, I find to be a bit offensive. We are briefing regularly, and those briefings are received and acted upon.
Okay, fair enough. With regards to that, I was speaking to this because due to the proximity, any line of questioning with respect to the People's Republic of China, I feel is relevant. Could you speak further to any security briefings that you're able to, that you have been in contact with the Prime Minister about in the last 2 weeks?
I'd just say 30-second response if you can, Ms. Thomas.
And I actually, so in the last 2 weeks, I actually can't tell you what we've briefed the Prime Minister on. I don't think that's appropriate, but there are constant briefings to the Prime Minister. He is briefed almost daily on the situation in Ukraine. That's an intelligence brief. He's briefed on the situation in Haiti. That's an intelligence brief. He's briefed on foreign interference when we have issues to raise to his attention. He sees, he has a daily foreign intelligence brief and he has a weekly Prime Minister's intelligence brief.
Thank you. Ms. Connell, you have the floor for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Sorry for the inappropriateness, but let's talk about then, let's follow up on some of the questions from the Conservatives. I was a member of NSICOP, and actually NSICOP in 2019 tabled in their annual report, the Conservatives should take note if they want a title of a report, in 2019 tabled in the House of Commons. They're in their annual report about foreign interference and spoke about potential election type of interference. So I guess this is more of a rhetorical question, but I mean, it's funny to me as somebody who sat on the committee, knows exactly the quality of documents that would have been provided under very strict national security and protection guidelines. Conservative members, conservative senators sat on that committee, would have reviewed that information, yet waited until 2022 to ever talk about foreign interference in elections when a report was tabled in the House of Commons, in the redacted form, of course, but spoke about it. So it's funny to me that Conservatives are only waking up to foreign interference now when there has been, I think, and maybe I'm biased because I was a member of NSICOP and I think they do incredible work, but actually provided information tabled in the House about foreign interference on an ongoing basis, including misinformation, disinformation, attempts on our elections. And then as a reaction to that, the Prime Minister is required, and I'm assuming you all and your teams, maybe not at that specific time, and you wouldn't have been in this role, but eventually has to actually respond to those reports. And one of the things that comes from that was the Site Committee and the nonpartisan panel of national security experts, and at the deputy director level, if I'm not mistaken, come together to determine during elections whether or not the threshold has been met, that constant foreign interference that happens all the time, doesn't mean it's successful, but that it happens, if it ever reaches that threshold that the public needs to be aware of, number one, and number two, how that communication is then made to Canadians so that it's not in some sort of partisan form or influence the election one way or the other. Part of that site role and response is also, and one of the things that came from ongoing foreign interference was actually the fact that major parties are now briefed on foreign interference, what to look for, how to protect themselves, how to advise their candidates, how to protect themselves, how to protect their data. Could you perhaps, anyone on the panel, but Ms. Thomas, if you want to start, could you talk about the briefings that political parties now receive that they never received in the past about foreign interference? And do you have any specifics on the dates that parties, whether in 2019 or the 2021 election, were actually briefed on foreign interference and how they can best protect themselves?
I think Mr. McDonald should answer.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Chair. You've described extremely well, actually, what's called the election security architecture and the various players that contribute to that governance of that space. It is correct, political parties. A call goes out to political parties via a letter to have candidates that can be security cleared that will then engage with officials during the election period. I was around for the 2021 general election and was part of organizing those briefings with the officials from the parties. And generally, the conversations were very educative and making sure that individuals knew that if they saw issues that caused concern, one, they knew where to go, but two, they also knew how to identify issues. Topics that were covered were foreign interference and what to look out for. Also, briefings were given on what is ideologically motivated violent extremism. Briefings were given on security. What is a security clearance? What does it mean? How does it operate? And then the last thing that those meetings were very instrumental for is it allowed the representatives from the parties a chance to ask any questions that they wanted to ask. And there was a range of questions that were asked. So it was very much a free-flowing exchange, also because they had security clearances. So we were able to share information.
Thank you. That's okay. Was the Conservative Party in the 2021 election, did they send a representative to be briefed on foreign interference?
Yes, they were.
Thank you.
Thank you. Move on to 2.5 minutes. Monsieur Desolet, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Ms. Thomas, once again, my questions will be for you. Do you believe that the lack of information or absence of an Arctic Council meetings is dangerous to some extent?
Thank you for that question. It's a very important question to ponder. In 2015, when Crimea was invaded, we had a similar situation where Russia was removed temporarily from the Arctic Council. And I think that the other nations managed very well in cooperation and continued dialogue on very important Arctic issues, economic issues, social issues, development issues. And so I think it's unfortunate. I think it's of their own making. I think that, again, you can't just decide when you're going to participate in the rules-based order.
In your opinion, is it dangerous or not for Canada? There's a diplomacy approach which is that it's always preferable to know what one's dealing with by having that country right there across the table from you, because that remains a tie that's not broken. Isn't it preferable that Russia remain at the table? Are you indicating yes by your body language?
So I think that is certainly a school of thought. That was seen at the G20, where Russia had representatives at the leaders' table. They didn't necessarily like what they were hearing and left. I think that each situation has to be judged on its merits, but in this particular case, I agree with the decision to remove, to hold the meetings in abeyance because Russia was the chair.
You said earlier that one needs to continue to invest in the Arctic. Why is that, given the current geopolitical context?
The Arctic, thank you. The Arctic is an enormous element of the Canadian land, our geographic, geopolitical structures. The Arctic is critical for the defense of North America through NORAD. I think there's a responsibility to Arctic peoples to invest in infrastructure for them, with them, and certainly not without them. I think that we have enormous riches in the Arctic that we need to protect, and that is the most important reason.
2.5 minutes flies right by. Ms. Matheson, you're 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So last May, Minister Anand announced that Canada was going to take a comprehensive look at joining U.S. missile ballistic defense system. Why was that conversation reopened, and how has that conversation continued, or has it ended?
Thank you for that. Within the Department of National Defense, certainly they're having the discussion, and I think that we'll see it continue as the defense policy review or update comes forward. What I think is important about BMD is that those three letters occupy a lot of discussion, when in fact what we should be talking about is missile defense and protection from Canada from all hazards that are coming at us. Ballistic missile defense is important, but there are many, many other threats, hypersonics, cruise missiles, weapons that can reach Canada's shore from a far distance, which is recent. Used to be that you would have to get a ship or a submarine or a bomber close to Canada, and now they can be launched from overseas and reach North America. And so I think that we need to take a broad view of what the missile threat is and what the North American response to that is going to be, as opposed to focusing on just BMD.
I was in a discussion, and the former ambassador from the UN on disarmament, Paul Mayer, I believe, he said ultimately that it would be easier, or it's far easier for nations to purchase that kind of equipment with its allies rather than working on peace with its enemies. In terms of a lot of those discussions, are you also, and how often are those diplomatic discussions happening, and how often do you discuss disarmament agreements?
Thank you for that question. I don't participate in those discussions. That's done through Global Affairs Canada.
I think that's it.
So back to 5 minutes. Final two questions. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I do want to begin just to correct the record on something that's been raised not just at this committee but also in the House of Commons, this notion that Conservative interest in election interference is something brand new. I understand that a quick Control-F sort of type search on Open Parliament reveals that Conservatives have raised the issue of foreign election interference 12,806 times in the House of Commons between 2015 and 2020. Well, we're not the government. 2015 and 2022, including 3,659 times between the 2015 and 2019 election. So this is a topic that is of much concern. Many of those interventions were from. I made some of those interventions myself, so I know this is something we've raised repeatedly. It's a real concern. So I would like to know, Ms. Thomas, when you mentioned in earlier on, you said it was as recently as 2 weeks ago, you briefed the Prime Minister on foreign interference. When was the first time you briefed him on foreign interference?
I can't give you a date. I'd have to look at my records.
Okay.
But foreign interference is a constant conversation. It's not just about elections. Foreign interference happens on a range of issues. We see foreign interference on misinformation, disinformation about what's going on in Ukraine.
Now, you have suggested at this table that the media reports of 11 candidates being financed by Beijing, you've characterized them as merely media reports. Are you suggesting that these reports are false?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying I do not know. There was a blurring of what's been reported to the Prime Minister and what's been reported in the press. And so I'm trying to differentiate them.
Right.
And I have not been briefed and have no awareness. And I've asked the question of 11 candidates and the connection to the money that was in that report. I know nothing of that. I have seen no evidence of it.
Are you concerned about it?
I am very concerned about it, which is why I've asked questions about it.
Okay. Do you think that you'll likely be able to find you'll be, with the resources available to the Government of Canada, that you could locate the sources that the media seem to have and find out if this is correct or not?
I think you've seen that the RCMP is doing an investigation to understand what's going on from the criminal perspective and who those sources could be, and whether there was an exchange of money. So that investigation is going on, and CSIS is constantly looking at foreign actors and state actors and their activities in Canada.
Thank you for clarifying that you're not denying the report, because we have heard this from the government, that the news story in the Globe and Mail is false, that kind of thing. So you're
What I've said is the Globe story was there. I have no evidence that says there were 11 candidates who received money.
all right. In your opening statement, you talked about you briefed the Prime Minister on situational awareness. We have a damning Auditor General report that talks about the looming obsolescence of nearly every bit of kit that we use to manage domain awareness in the Arctic, especially our satellite surveillance. How we have a 9-year gap projected in the replacement of that system. How does that affect domain awareness in the Arctic and your ability to brief the government and brief the Prime Minister on situational awareness?
Thank you for that question. I think that domain awareness is a critical element of NORAD modernization that's been described to you and certainly was announced earlier this year. The approach that has been taken to domain awareness is a system of systems, so that there is not just one source of information.
I only have less than a minute left. How are you going to deal with the 9-year gap? What's the plan B on the 9-year gap?
We're working with the Department of National Defense.
So there's no plan yet.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not in the Department of National Defense, and that is their responsibility, and they are actively ensuring that there is no fail in our ability to have domain awareness in the Arctic.
But how are you going to do that when the satellites are there's going to be a 9-year gap between the projected failure and the new system?
There are alliances we can have, other satellites in space in rotation where we can obtain information.
I got to cut you off there. That you're out of time, and I appreciate the answers. Brian May, Mr. May, you got to clean up. Last 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our witnesses today. And I wanted to kind of bring us back to, focusing on the Arctic a little more here, given that that's what our topic is that we're supposed to be talking about. Back in 2018, we've already discussed this, but China released its official Arctic paper, where it declared itself a near Arctic state, which most of the allies that I've spoken to kind of chuckle at that, but there's serious consequences to drawing that distinction, and within that document, China talks about the economic possibilities in the region that it offers, but it also talks about China's developing military projection capabilities that would extend into the Arctic region. Can you share the implications of that Arctic policy, China's Arctic policy, on Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic?
Thank you for that question. China's interest in the Arctic is, I would say, it's threefold. One, economic, absolutely. It is shorter shipping routes and from Europe, and it will save them significant money. Two, it is expansionist. That's the determination of themselves as a near Arctic state. But they are they have a voracious appetite for hydrocarbons, for rare earth minerals, and for fish. And so they see it as a critical element of their sustainability as a nation. And so we have to ensure that the rich resources that are in the Canadian Arctic are protected. And so even science is always a huge issue when we're talking about national security. And yes, that need to share science for the benefit of all is really critical. But we also have to be aware and careful about what's being collected on science missions in the Arctic when they send icebreakers to the Arctic. And so it is understanding what is being done when they're there and ensuring that we have some management of it, I think, are the critical elements.
In your conversations with our allies, what is their view of China's Arctic policy paper?
I would say it is absolutely in line with ours.
And are they taking different steps? Like what are they doing to respond to that Arctic paper?
You've seen, I think, the United States has announced their Arctic foreign policy, which Jordan can speak to. If you are interested in some detail, we're seeing the Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy each have an Arctic strategy now. The U.S. is renewing their icebreaker fleet, and particularly their large icebreakers, for the exact same reason that we are. And our cooperation with the United States is, of course, seamless.
Chair, if I may add very quickly, there are dedicated bodies where Canada and the U.S. work exclusively on Arctic intelligence issues. It's also discussed in Five Eyes bodies where we look at policy issues and operational issues, specifically focusing on the Arctic. And that's where the greatest strength comes, is from those long allegiance of intelligence cooperations.
I have a minute and a half left, and I do want to hear from Jordan. But if in your response, if you can not just include the U.S. response, but maybe what is Canada doing to curb attempts by China to assert itself in the north?
So maybe just a couple of points to pick up on. The first is to say there are a number of initiatives within the Arctic Council that are continuing to be pursued, even as Russia is not involved in those. Many of them don't involve Russia, and they involve the full range of Arctic states. So I think it's important to just reiterate that a lot of the work on research, on environmental sustainability, on the importance of drawing on and understanding the role of Indigenous peoples and communities is all ongoing. That's work that continues to happen across all of those areas. And I would say, so in addition to the Arctic Council members, apart from Russia, that there are a number of other bodies. There are security meetings that have taken place. There are defense conversations in various configurations, bilaterally, trilaterally, and obviously working closely with Norway as they assume the role of chair going into next year.
With us today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I want to thank our witnesses as well. Ms. Thoms, can I just ask you to provide a written response back to committee? One thing that I'm as a member of this committee, very concerned about is are going to be spending tens of billions of dollars in upgrading North Warning System, satellites, NORAD modernization, signals, and communications. And with the story about what happened to the RCMP procurement and Hytera that have been being investigated for espionage in the States, we went through the Huawei debacle and everything that was surrounded with our Five Eye partners. How are we going to, if you can get back to us on what procurement changes are going to happen to ensure that we aren't going to be caught in this situation again where Chinese state-controlled enterprises are interfering in our procurement processes? So thank you very much. Let's go. Just
order. Mr. Chair, it would have been appropriate for the Conservatives to ask that question during that time, to seek a written response on a question that was never asked in the allotted time. Then we should be able to put forward questions like, I would love to know a written report on the Conservative inaction on foreign interference from...
Now, the point of order, you're now into debate. I'm going to move on. We do have our Office of the Auditor General's office is waiting to come up next. So I just, again, thank our witnesses for appearing today. It will help inform our study on Arctic security. Thank you very much. We're going to suspend. We swap out witnesses. welcome everyone. We're going to continue on with our study on Arctic surveillance and security. We do have in front of us, as part of the study, and Standing Order 1082, and the motion that we passed on November 15th was to invite the Office of the Auditor General to talk about their sixth report on Arctic water surveillance. So joining us now from the Office of the Auditor General is the Auditor General herself, Karen Hogan, Chantal Thibodeau, who is the Director, and Nicholas Swalis, who is a Principal. So I want to thank all of you for being here. Ms. Hogan, you have 5 minutes for your opening comments.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on the surveillance of Canada's Arctic waters, which was tabled in the House of Commons on November 15th. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Joining me today are Nicholas Swales, the principal who was responsible for the audit, and Chantal Thibodeau, the director who led the audit team. In recent decades, Canada's Arctic waters have become more accessible as summer sea ice has declined and navigation technologies have improved. This has generated interest and competition in the region, significantly increasing ship traffic and affecting local communities. Growing maritime traffic increases the risk of unauthorized access, illegal activities, and safety and pollution incidents. For this audit, we wanted to know whether key federal organizations built the maritime domain awareness needed to respond to safety and security risks and incidents associated with increasing vessel traffic in Arctic waters. No federal organization is solely responsible for the surveillance of Canada's Arctic waters. In our audit, we included the 5 organizations that are mainly responsible: Transport Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard, the National Defence, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. We found that over the past decade, these organizations have repeatedly identified gaps in surveillance of Arctic waters, but they have not taken action to address them. These gaps include limited capabilities to build a complete picture of ship traffic in the Arctic, and the inability to track and identify vessels that don't use digital tracking systems, either because they don't have to or because they are not complying with requirements. Collaboration is important to mitigate gaps in maritime domain awareness. Coastal communities contribute information through direct observation. Federal initiatives, such as the Marine Security Operations Center in Halifax, also plays a key role. However, we found that weaknesses in the mechanisms that support information sharing, decision-making, and accountability affected the center's efficiency. La surveillance des eaux arctiques s'appuie sur
Arctic water surveillance relies on several types of equipment such as satellites, aircraft, and ships. We found that much of this equipment is old, and its renewal has been delayed to the point that some equipment will likely need to be retired before it can be replaced. This is a situation for the Canadian Coast Guard's icebreakers and Transport Canada's single patrol airplane. They are near the end of their service lives and likely to be retired before new equipment can be delivered. Satellites are also nearing the end of their service lives and currently do not meet surveillance needs. Replacements in all cases are many years away. We've also found that the infrastructure projects aimed at supporting the surveillance aircraft and offshore patrol ships were delayed. For example, the Nunavik Naval Facility, intended to support government vessels in Arctic waters, is behind schedule and has been reduced in scope to the point that it will operate only about 4 weeks per year. As a result, Royal Canadian Navy ships may not be resupplied where and when needed. Our 2021 audit on the National Shipbuilding Strategy raised concerning delays in the delivery of the combat and non-combat ships that Canada needs to meet its domestic and international obligations. That audit also noted that further delays could result in several vessels being retired before new vessels are operational. In this audit, we found that those delays persist. Effective surveillance in the Arctic relies on marine vessels, aircraft and satellites, all of which are ageing. The government urgently needs to address these long-standing issues and put equipment renewal on a sustainable path to protect Canada's interests in the Arctic. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks, and we'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. We're going to go to our first round. Mr. Pat Kelly, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this report, I mean, I spent much of my first Parliament on public accounts, and these reports are so incredibly important to Canadians. And they're often very frustrating to read because they often reveal problems that have been identified long ago, often spanning multiple governments, that just don't get addressed. So the imminent failure or coming to the end, the obsolescence of much of our infrastructure to maintain domain awareness in the Arctic are coming to an end, and the replacements are not going to be there on time. Can you talk about the satellite program? The 9-year gap is just stunning. Can you comment on that and comment on the government's response to date?
So I'm going to have to turn to Nick for some of the additional details. I mean, when we looked at the satellites in this audit, it was around whether or not the government had the capabilities to gather the maritime domain awareness. And what we found was that the satellites were not meeting the current needs, that if a priority request came up, another request was bumped down on the list. And we did highlight the aging and, as you mentioned, the length of time to replace these. So, you know, what we're looking for is for the government to have a bit of a contingency plan. What will happen should these satellites reach the end of their useful lives? And right now, the government either buys information commercially or turns to its allies. And we encourage them to have a bit of a contingency plan in addition to doing that.
Okay,
I don't know if you want more details, maybe Mr. Swales could provide.
Actually, I would like that, because that's an important point, that it's not merely that the satellites are going to reach the end of their expected life in 2026 and not be replaced until 2035. They're already not fulfilling the need in the Arctic. Could you elaborate that?
Well, that's certainly the situation, that there are multiple departments seeking information from these satellites, and they can't. All of their needs are not currently being met. What's troubling is that the lifespan of satellites, as you can see from the information we provide, is relatively short, at least the expected time that they will work, and yet it takes a long time at the moment for the government to develop new satellites. So decision-making is certainly a problem here.
If a vessel in Canadian Arctic water turned off its transponder, how would Canada be able to track that vessel?
Well, I think tracking vessels is not just by satellite, so it would be with aircraft, with visual confirmation. That's why collaboration and coordination with the coastal Inuit communities is essential. We highlighted a couple of programs there that while there is an effort to work with those communities, they're very slow to develop those programs.
Does Canada possess the capability to track a vessel that is without a transponder throughout the entire Arctic? I mean, do we have the aircraft and shore-based capability to maintain domain awareness if the vessel is uncooperative?
So what we found is that that was an identified gap that the government themselves had identified several years ago. In repeated assessments on gaps, they re-identify it, but there's just no action or solution taken to resolve that gap.
Now, and that's what is so frustrating to, I think, all Canadians and this spans governments. This is not a partisan shot. This is a real problem in Canada where a problem is repeatedly identified and action isn't taken. What confidence can Canadians have that this time is somehow going to be different?
So I'm often asked that question, I'll be really honest. I can't tell you what confidence, to what degree of confidence that departments will take action. They've agreed to our recommendations, and I do think it's about finding different solutions. So one is about a lot of analysis has happened. Now it's time to actually develop some concrete plans to address the analysis.
Now this
instead of refining the analysis, let's take some action to address it.
Indeed. So what has this government, since 2016, this government has delayed in implementing these solutions. They've had 7 years now. What are the most urgent? Let's go beyond the satellite piece, and I know you've got recommendations that are identified, but what are the absolute priorities to maintain domain awareness in the Arctic?
Well, I think it would cover all elements, right? It's not just one factor that is about maintaining domain awareness. You need to have good collaboration with all stakeholders in the Arctic, good collaboration amongst the federal entities in the Arctic. We identified that there are still some weaknesses in information sharing that could make it more effective and timely. But then there's also the equipment that you need. So the priority really is up to the government as to what will come first. But you need ships, you need aircraft, you need facilities, you need individuals, you need satellites.
Are any of these items on track to either maintain or in some cases create the necessary domain awareness to maintain Arctic security?
I would refer you to an exhibit that we included in our audit report that actually sort of mapped out the current expected useful life and or extensions, and then the current expectation of when the government believes replacement equipments will be available. You'll see that in some of those,
if I may, sorry, because I've got it right here on page 17, and you've got some ships that maybe have way down the line an expectation that they're going to arrive just in time to replace an existing one, yet that assumes there's no further delays and every single ship. All right.
We are out of time, and unfortunately I'm going to have to be because we have such a short period with the Auditor General. I'm going to move on. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General and your team for being here and for providing very, very important oversight to the government. So I certainly appreciate personally the work that you folks do. You talked about the 5 relevant federal organizations: Transport, Fisheries, Coast Guard, National Defense, and ECCC, Environment, Climate Change. Did all of the relevant federal agencies cooperate with and provide information to your office in a timely manner, in your opinion?
Absolutely. If we have any concerns with cooperation or disagreements with any of the entities in our audits, we are always transparent and include that in our audit report. And so we received great cooperation from all the organizations involved.
Wonderful. Thank you. You also said to the last questioner that there was an agreement with your recommendations. So again, thank you for that. If that's something that can move us forward in a more expedient manner, then that's a good thing. Can you name some of the specific initiatives that the government is undertaking to address some of the recommendations in your report, some of the things that we're doing? I guess not exclusively, but for instance, National Transport Canada, working to address the National Aerial Surveillance Program fleet. Other examples are welcome as well.
Well, I might turn to Nick to see if he has anything that he'd like to add to that, but it's a little early on. So we get departmental responses to our recommendations, and they signal agreement and give us a bit of a high-level plan of action, which we publish in our audit reports. It's then up to each department to develop a detailed action plan and to put that into action and progress on it. Those, I expect, will have clear accountabilities and timelines and clear steps. I have not not reviewed their detailed action plans, but they typically provide them to the Public Accounts Committee when they are called for a hearing. So I would expect that once the Public Accounts sits down to study this report, that a detailed action plan will be made publicly available.
Does Mr. Swales want to speak to the, perhaps to the aerial surveillance program fleet, or maybe some other initiatives that you might see that will line up with recommendations?
Well, the one thing that we obviously would require more details on what Transport Canada intends to do about that, the NAS program. What I would say is that the issue of ships was also addressed in our 2021 report on the National Shipbuilding Strategy, and in that, Public Service and Procurement Canada in particular committed to some actions around better ways of monitoring scheduling that they are in the process of implementing. So there is action being taken there. Clearly, in the time between that report and this one, it hasn't yet borne fruit.
How do the investments, the National Defence's massive investments in NORAD modernization, tie in with our overall maritime domain awareness?
So the focus of our audit was on surveillance of waters, which is separate from surveillance of the airspace, which is the responsibility of NORAD mostly. The one area where they do overlap is that NORAD has a maritime warning mission, as it's called, and but that really comes at the tail end of this maritime surveillance exercise. So we talk at one point about the effort to integrate information systems. That information is then passed to NORAD, and NORAD combines that with its intelligence work to provide that maritime warning mission. So the investments that have been talked about so far for additional radars and so on don't really touch on this. We need to get our act together on integrating our maritime information first before NORAD will be able to contribute here.
Are there other investments that we're making that you see us moving in the right direction?
Well, I mean, obviously, in terms of the maritime surveillance, I think that we would need to see the detailed actions plans of the entities to know how they're going to deal with some of the issues that we raised.
Did you go to school on other Arctic nations as to what they're doing and what things that we might have been able to learn from other Arctic nations and what they're doing for maritime awareness?
No, in the scope of our audit, we really did focus in on what the federal government was doing. We do highlight that there are interactions and reliance with international partners, but we did not look to the work that they are doing. I think it's well known that the Canadian government doesn't spend a great deal right now on military investments, and I think we're seeing it through the National Shipbuilding Strategy, the additional delays, right? So it isn't so much about what you're spending, but about getting faster to being able to find the replacement equipment and having them operational is what Canada should be focusing on.
Did your office consider making a visit to the Arctic when you were doing this report? Would that, do you think, have allowed a different perspective?
So typically we do actually always spend some time with Indigenous communities and take a trip up, but because of the pandemic, we did restrict our travel for this audit and focused in on what awareness the federal organizations had here.
Thank you very much. Time has expired.
Thank you.
Monsieur Desolé, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our guests for being here today. Ms. Hogan, it's the third time in 2 weeks that I've witnessed you appear before a committee, and it's the first time that I have heard such worrying remarks with such potential major ramifications. I'm not an alarmist kind of guy usually, but at all levels, aircraft, vessels, satellites, this has an impact on national security, on Indigenous people, on procurement, etc., etc., etc. Now, is your reading of this just like mine, i.e., we are in a shitty situation, to put it frankly? Well, I hope that all the issues I raise in Parliament are issues that everyone wishes to discuss fulsomely. I hope to bring to the table topics that are worthwhile debating. What we have observed here is that we do have a presence in the Arctic, but we do have misgivings that if there's not immediate action taken, there will be gaps in the upcoming decade. Are you confident that those gaps can be filled? I am confident that there is a willingness to fill those gaps, but actions speak louder than words, and we'll see if it's feasible at the end of the day. Now, in previous years, have you spoken about national defence and associated files publicly? No, I haven't myself. I've only been in my position for about 2.5 years. But our office, for a number of decades, has tabled reports about procurement gaps, and national defence files. To your knowledge, in the reports that have previously been tabled over the past decade, surely there have been recommendations akin to yours. Yes, indeed. I referred back to our 2020 report on the national shipbuilding strategy, which attested to gaps and delays in the replacement of vessels. And at that time, we recommended that we needed to get back on track in terms of shipbuilding. But what we've noticed in our study of Arctic water surveillance, in our audit, is that there are even more delays and that there's no more wiggle room, basically, and it's high time that action is taken. In the discussions you've had, is there any action plan that has been laid out? I know that's what you want and what you're looking for, but is there any plan of action that's been laid out given the urgent state of affairs? Response, as I've mentioned, as my colleagues previously mentioned, we know that there are enhancements slated to the vessel shipbuilding procurement process, but evidently there needs to be more monitoring and oversight of the contract process for more vessels, satellites, aircraft. There needs to be an analysis, but not an analysis that's going to bog us down. Decisions need to be made. Action needs to be taken, and clearly there's a state of inertia, in your opinion. Is this imperiling our country's national security, this current state of affairs? Response, yes, there is a presence Canada enjoys in the Arctic. There are gaps, there are shortcomings. We do rely on a certain number of allies. But it's time to take action and walk the talk, because it's going to become dangerous over the next 10 years. You said that we have to rely on our allies to meet our own needs. Response, well, of course, the Arctic is a shared area of jurisdiction. We're not the only country that needs to be interested in the Arctic. You're a great politician in the sense that you answered that question. Now, if you had one recommendation to tie all this together, political action, political willingness, money, one single recommendation. We've made a slew of recommendations. In our opinion, they're all as important as each other, and they need to be addressed and taken seriously by the government. What will it take for the government, a Liberal government, a Conservative government, what will it take for them to take this seriously? You're neutral here. What do we need? What will it take? A disaster? Again, I am the neutral party here. I bring to the table, I shed light on what's good, what's not so good, I make recommendations. The onus is on the public service, parliamentarians, officials to ensure that action is taken. Thank you very much.
Merci. Ms. Matheson, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being with us today. So we're talking about these significant gaps in our procurement, in the equipment, that our armed forces, our military needs, and yet that procurement process takes a great deal of time. Obviously, in terms of those gaps that we've seen. One of the things that you mentioned briefly, you did talk a little bit in your report about the Canadian Rangers, Canadian Auxiliary, Coast Guard, and the volunteers that are part of that. We heard in a previous meeting directly from, well, he wasn't able to contribute in in words, but he was part of our conversations and he's reported to this committee, but ultimately what's needed on the ground for those Canadian Rangers. So could you talk a bit more about what government spending needs to happen for those folks on the ground, for Canadian Rangers, but also in terms of Mr. Peterson was one of our witnesses, and he said that training needs to happen for more of the search and rescue folks on the ground. So could you talk a bit more about that in your report?
I'll let you go. If you don't mind, Mr. Chair, I'll ask Mr. Swales to add to that.
The Rangers were not a significant part of our work because their role is mostly on the ground. They don't have a maritime mission per se. What we do speak to in the report is that, of course, where there are communities, where there are people, that is another source of maritime domain awareness information. And we talk about a project that was put in place to provide a linkage to those communities to some of the other domain awareness information that the government had. That initiative has proceeded slowly, but at present is being rolled out on a more permanent basis.
In terms of that gap, though, I mean, it's going to take a long time for us to build those ships. So the realization of people on the ground, that fills that gap. I mean, there was the ship that was missed by a number of that equipment, and it was people on the ground that saw that. So how important is that shift in terms of investment in people and what they need on the ground, in your opinion, if you can give it?
And I don't know if it's important to shift from equipment to people. I think it's about investing in all sources of information. A complete picture of maritime traffic requires all pieces of equipment because someone who is trying to avoid can fail one and you hope the other piece of equipment will find them. So it's really about investing in all in order to build that complete picture about maritime domain awareness.
Okay. We've heard a lot about, or I certainly have, in terms of the flaws in government procurement process. I know we all have. And in fact, I spoke with one of the folks from the National Shipbuilding Strategy, the determination that governments, military, they need to provide final details, final plans, and that they're not great about doing that. That's one of the problems that they found within the procurement process. Another, we were at a forum. Multiple parties were at a forum, and they talked about the partisanship and the partisan nature of the procurement process. Could you talk a bit about how we need to streamline, if you could, about that military procurement? There are many suggestions that have been made, but overall, could you see suggestions within that?
Well, I'll start with comments and then maybe see if Nick would like to add. He's been auditing national defense and issues for many years, so he's definitely got a lot more detail than I do. When we looked at the national shipbuilding strategy, it wasn't so much at the procurement, but really at the management of that strategy and the management of those contracts. And you're right, they were lengthy to put into place, and then there were delays in defining requirements, and that those delays really just kept compounding and pushing out. And sometimes there's a large delay between signing an agreement with the shipyard, but then having an actual construction agreement is another one. So it is rather complex and time-consuming, but it does start with having clear requirements laid out, but then clear milestones to better manage the achievement of those milestones. So I don't know, Nick, if there's anything more that you wanted to add in, because I know in these two we didn't really look specifically at contracting per se.
I think I would just add, and following a little bit on an earlier response, that timely decision-making is important too, and that's one of the issues we see with the satellite programs, is that decisions to start taking action are already happening after it's too late to get the result in a timely manner.
So just before you came, we had Jody Thomas in with us, National Security Advisor. She said that actually what she would like to see is more of a cyclical plan for procurement and the evergreening. Could you weigh in on that?
Well, I think having a more long-term vision and actually not just waiting for one procurement to be done and then starting the next procurement is a great way of sort of making it more efficient. There's lots of ways to make procurement more efficient, and I trust that the government will explore different and unusual ways instead of repeating the past and hoping to have a different outcome.
Ms. Shamdar? I will wait until the next round. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Everybody being brief in their questions. We'll continue on. So we're going to the 5-minute round. Ms. Kramp-Nyman.
Thank you. And thanks for all of you for being here this morning. I guess it's almost this afternoon now. First question is, what do you make of the fact that the government is reducing instead of increasing the resources in the north, specifically with regards to the lack of heating for the fuel in Nansvik and the fact that it only operates a few weeks of the year?
Well, as I mentioned, there's so many elements that you need to invest in order to make sure that you have good maritime domain awareness, and having the infrastructure that supports the vessels and the aircrafts and the individuals that are operating in the north is essential. And we did highlight the Nanisivik Naval Facility and saw that the budget was originally set at a certain level and then reduced. And then that reduction resulted in removing sort of the ability to heat the fuel in the north, which then rendered that facility really only operational for about 4 weeks out of the year. In our view, that's not good value for money, and recommended that you need to find better ways to support those vessels. In the absence of that facility, the Canadian government needs to look to commercial means or allies to help fill those gaps.
Perfect, thank you. You also talk in your report with regards to insufficient data about vessel traffic in our Arctic waters and the renewal of vessels, aircraft, satellites, and infrastructure that support that monitoring has fallen terribly behind. So how high is the risk to our ability to do the monitoring, given how we are onboarding these new capabilities?
I think that's the main message really coming out of our audit, is that there is a presence in the Arctic now. But there are some gaps in surveillance because we know that certain satellites aren't meeting the needs. That if action isn't taken, there is a significant risk that there will be gaps in surveillance capabilities and the presence in the Arctic in the next decade. Which is why our national shipbuilding strategy sort of highlighted the need to take some real concrete action now to turn replacement of vessels on a viable path, but we're just seeing that those delays are persisting. And so, this is a second call to action quickly so that we don't run into significant gaps as a country in the Arctic.
Perfect, thank you. Touched on earlier with the Rangers. They seem to be our first line of defense, and we really are reliant on them in our Arctic. And do our Inuit monitors and Rangers have access to drones to help them do surveillance of our Arctic? And if not, why not? And if so, how capable are they?
So I am going to turn to Nick on that. I do believe that drones are in the plans, but I don't want to misspeak, so I'm going to see if Nick has any insights.
As we mentioned in the report, there are plans for both military and civilian drones to operate in the Arctic. They are not specifically aligned with the Rangers, and we didn't look at the capabilities of the Rangers in this report.
Thank you. So if Russians have a submarine in our Arctic waters right now, do you think, or are we able to immediately identify that threat? Yes or no?
So that's hard for us to answer because our audit was really based on the surface, maritime awareness, not subsurface and not air. So it really is a question asked best to the parties in the Arctic.
We know that the government has announced funding to modernize NORAD. Clearly, national defense has the money to do it, but we still see very little progress on the points that you have raised in your report. Everything from satellite surveillance, icebreakers, patrol aircraft, infrastructure. So given the amount of time it takes to procure and build these things and build the infrastructure that they need to survive in the North, how confident are you that we have the domain awareness we need in the Arctic in the next 5 years?
I think our audit identified right now that there are gaps in the maritime domain awareness. So the longer that those gaps persist and action isn't taken to fix them, then the wider that gap will become, or the more reliance that will be needed on other means, which is why we have called to action so that these gaps don't become more significant in the next decade.
You conclude your report by saying National Defence and Transport Canada has not taken the action required to build the maritime domain awareness they collectively need to respond to safety and security risks associated with increasing vessel traffic in Arctic waters. So my question is, do you believe it's failure of companies tasked with building these capabilities, or is it failure of political will?
I mean, that's, again, a tough one for me to answer because we're looking at what the Federal Public Service is doing. And there are many gaps that were repeatedly identified in 2011, 14, 15, 16, 2021, and then the call for a third party to look at gaps. Those keep just refining the gap identification. They confirm similar gaps, and it's really just now about taking action. I think you'd have to ask the departments involved in our audit what is hindering their ability to take the action needed.
Thank you. Has expired, so we're going to move on. Next question to Ms. Lambropoulos, please.
Lambropoulos.
Lambropoulos.
Thank you, Mr. Bizan. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us today, and I guess I'm not 100% sure if you'll be able to answer my questions, but you can guide me as to whether or not these are you have thoughts on these questions. So first of all, we know that many of our NATO allies, NATO partners, and maybe not many of them, but some of them, and the goal of NATO is 2% spending. What are your thoughts on upping our defense spending to match that 2%?
So
what are your thoughts?
it really isn't my place to comment on policy decisions. It's my place to hold the government to account for running their programs in accordance with those policy decisions.
I guess, do you think the question is more, do you think that based on the recommendations that you have in your report, obviously you think more spending needs to happen in order to be able to accomplish the recommendations that you have, of course?
So our audit identified that the government identified it has needs, and that those needs include having extra ships, new satellites, and new aircraft. Those all come with additional spending. I wouldn't argue that it's about necessarily always more money, but maybe more effective procurement so that you can minimize cost increases. Delays traditionally bring about cost increases.
And we've mentioned several times today during this meeting that these ships do take a long time to build, of course. And I'm wondering what you think the reason for these gaps might be. I know you're not necessarily looking at that, but what, based on this report and in comparison to past reports, what might be some of the reasons why we are behind on where we should be?
So I would encourage the committee to perhaps look at our national shipbuilding strategy audit earlier on. And in that audit, we did talk about how the strategy isn't just to procure and buy new ships. It was about supporting an industry, and there were many factors. And so there is a give and take in the procurement process because that the strategy is more than just procuring ships. So again, I would encourage you to have a conversation with National Defence about the actions they've taken to address some of the recommendations that we provided in that shipbuilding strategy to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of contract management in order to get the ships in a more timely way.
Okay, and of course, thank you for that. I appreciate the recommendation. Of course, any action taken by any government has certain side effects and a ripple effect on future governments as well, because when something isn't necessarily done or when spending stops at a certain point, there needs certain catch up, of course, to be done. Do you think that it would be accurate to say that some of the gaps and where we are currently at could also be partly due to some of the backlog left behind? For example, when in the early 2010s, there were some serious cutbacks on defense spending. Do you think that possibly some of the reasons why we are where we are today could be because of, how we've chosen to spend over the last couple of decades, the last decade?
Well, I think the safety, security, and sovereignty of our Arctic is something that all parliaments should be concerned with. And that, of course, every decision has a ripple effect. And all we looked at here was the actions currently being taken between April and April of 2021 and March of 2022. I can just give you a state of the situation now. And I think trying to find a better solution, looking forward and finding viable solutions to speed up delivery is the best place for everyone to focus on.
Thank you. And given the current, I mean, you spoke a little bit about the shipbuilding strategy and how we should be looking towards that report and seeing how we can make it a more efficient strategy. What would you say are some of the current obstacles that lie in the way of reaching certain goals that you've set out?
If I might
Mr.
comment
Swales,
briefly. From the previous report, one of the things we commented on was the something called target state in the shipbuilding strategy, the ability to produce ships efficiently, and that was part of the strategy. There were some issues that we identified with how that was being implemented, and recommended that that be improved with the new shipyard that's going to be added. That is still in train, but that would still be an important component to making improvement there.
Go to 2.5 minutes for the next couple of questions. Monsieur Désolé, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Ms. Hogan, I appreciated your previous remark saying that it should be the concern of all governments because we're talking about national security here. You said, however, that the contract process was highly complex. I think we all understand that, but any responsible government should be a responsible steward and manager. And despite the complexity of the contract process, one should be able, whether liberal or conservative or a blockist, to be able to see things through to their natural end. I'm not blaming anyone here, but I think that this is something that must be borne in mind. Now, in your knowledge, would it be beneficial, or in your opinion, would it be beneficial to know what other countries are doing in terms of their orders and building process? Response: yes, I agree with you. One knows the service lives of our equipment ahead of time, and we should be able to foresee any need to replace that equipment. It just doesn't happen out of the blue without any forward warning. So I agree with you that it does take some degree of forward planning, and that will be required going forward. But to properly respond to your question, well, it's really quite tough to answer because the contract process needs to be forward-looking. And the shipbuilding procurement process involves much more than just buying vessels. A balance needs to be struck, and achieving that balance is causing delays in the replacement of vessels. I understand what you're saying, but to my mind, that's not a sufficient justification that we find ourselves in that situation. Are there exemplary countries that we could emulate? Russia, for example, is increasing its presence. Its budgets are being increased. Are there any? I'm not suggesting we model ourselves on them, but what about other countries? Well, yes, it is worthwhile to look into what other countries are doing. That is another source of information that we could rely on to improve our contract management process and procurement process for the Arctic. Final question? No? No final question. Okie doke. Thank you.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Matheson.
In terms of, again, that expansion, that extension of the lifetime of the equipment that we're talking about, the ships, it's overall in terms of all military equipment, but there are a lot of questions in terms of how long we can actually make things last in order to cover that gap that you've laid out here. Was there any concern? Was there any conversations, of course, about the concern that the government needs to have about ensuring the safety of our troops, the servicemen and women who have to actually work on that equipment. I think about the comrades. I think about our subs. I think about, and I know that you didn't do that specifically in terms of that, but if you could give a comment in the time that I have.
I think the comment I would offer is that life extensions don't always extend life as much as hoped for. So that's one of the concerns we have when we see that they're counting on life extension as being the means by which you cover gaps. There have been a couple of recent examples of Coast Guard ships that were life extended and then pulled out of service much more quickly. I don't think that's a commentary on the safety of those ships. I would expect the decisions were made at the right time, but it does show that life extension is not the silver bullet here.
I mean, as ultimately the government of Canada, it is the employer. It has a responsibility to ensure the health and safety of the equipment it provides its workers. So in terms of that conversation, was that ever explored, or is that something that you would be looking at in the future in terms of specifically about the extension of the equipment that you looked at in that lifetime?
So we really didn't focus in on the ship, the safety and security of individuals on a ship or in a vessel. We really focused in on the global picture of maritime domain awareness that was needed and the gaps that are created by the equipment needed to support that, just reaching the end of its useful lives. So it's a question I think you should ask National Defence and the Coast Guard.
Is that something that your office would run in terms of a audit in the future?
I guess it's always something we could include in the scope. We have lots of work planned, obviously, in national defense, and so I thank you for the suggestion. And Nick is hearing it, so we'll see what we can do in future audits.
No doubt you're kept fairly busy.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our last two 5-minute questions. Ms. Gallant.
Auditor General, you outlined a 2020 case of a vessel which sailed into Canadian Arctic waters without approval. Was the intent of that vessel to make landfall in Canada's Arctic without permission? And where did it come from?
For the specifics of that, I'm going to see if Nick has any and if we can share them. So.
I'm actually going to turn it to Chantal to speak to that specific case.
May I just... Sorry, but thank you, for, Mr. Chair. May I just ask you to repeat in which case that you were referring to?
The 2020 case of a vessel which sailed into Canadian Arctic waters without approval. Was it the intent to make landfall without permission, and where did it come from?
That's right. So this example makes reference to a ship that was registered from New Zealand, the Kiri Roa. And so we have, we don't have any details as such as to, what was,
You've answered my question with telling me where it's from. If the Russians have a submarine in our Arctic waters right now, can we immediately identify that threat? Yes or no?
So unfortunately, our audit didn't look at subsurface or air. We really looked at ship traffic on the water. So again, you'd have to ask the National Defence and Coast Guard that question.
So the sensors underwater were not part of your audit?
Correct. We did not look at subsurface.
Okay. Do our Inuit monitors and rangers have access to drones to help them do surveillance in our Arctic?
So I believe we had a similar question earlier on, and we answered that we know that drones are in the plans, but we do not know who will be actually using those.
Okay. There was a $15 billion black hole in the defense budget. In your audit, did you find any evidence that some of the money that we could not find it listed in the budget, but that was allocated, is somehow going to the Arctic?
So I'm not sure that I know what money you're talking about, so it's really difficult for me to answer that question.
All right. So apparently we decided not to engage with renewing the contract for the green hangar up there. Did you have anything to do with the hangarage for the aircraft to be there in the Arctic, the only Arctic refueling station.
The few infrastructure projects we looked at, I mentioned earlier, was the Nanisivik Naval Facility, and I'm not sure that you're referring to the same facility, so I don't have any information on that.
The one at Inuvik.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I do not have any information
Okay,
on that facility.
now let's go back to Nanisivik then. It was supposed to be a full-blown naval facility. It was reduced after 2015 to be a basic refueling station. And now in your report, you mentioned that it has barely any significance at all. It won't be of that much help. Is that because it's been hollowed out, or is it the positioning of the naval facility that makes it of no importance to our Navy?
It's based on our audit work. It was because the budget was reduced after its initial scoping and setup, and that the reduction in the budget resulted in the fact that the heating of the fuel tanks was no longer capable of being covered in the current budget, and hence the facility is only operational 4 weeks out of the year.
Right, so we know from your report that the Interdepartmental Marine Security Working Group has been repeatedly identifying gaps in maritime surveillance. It's clear the group's it's clear the government knows what the gaps are. So why haven't they been addressed yet? And why does it seem that this government's just ignoring them?
I think I'm going to ask Mr. Swales to talk a little bit about that.
I think what I would say is that we didn't really look at the motivation of those actions. What we did notice was in 2015 that a work plan had been identified to take action on it, but there was no follow up on that. So again, it's a circumstance where action needs to be taken, and there needs to be a process for ensuring that occurs.
Okay, and time has expired. So, Ms. O'Connell, you have the last round of questions.
Mr. Chair. Thank you. Just following up, and thank you all for being here. On the last point, the Nunavik Naval Facility, it was descoped, or it was announced originally in 2007, correct? And descoped in 2013? 2012? So it was a previous government decision to descope, correct?
So I believe that the original cost was set in 2010 and it was reduced in 2012.
Perfect. Thank you. Just to clarify that on the record of where the descoping happened. In terms of, again, following up on Mr. Kelly's point that successive governments have struggled in terms of moving forward in this space. For example, the polar icebreaker, the Harper government announced in 2010 that it would begin construction in 2013 for delivery in 2017. Obviously, that didn't happen. After 2013, the Conservative government had no plan for when they would complete the polar icebreaker, and not a single vessel was delivered under the Harper government for the NSS. So again, you've identified and the government has accepted your recommendations, and there seems to be a real challenge when it comes to perhaps not identifying the gaps or the scope that's needed, but then moving forward on kind of that evergreen plan that of planning and procurement. Would you say the blockage or what stops, and this is perhaps opinion based on the work that you've done, but is it a logistical issue of actually being able to procure these vessels in a manner that would have that kind of regular timing of when a new one was needed versus the construction and ongoing maintenance? Or is it just the lack of, or is it possibly that there is too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, when you have so many departments responsible for the overall monitoring in the Arctic, that not having kind of this singular planner, so to speak, is that the issue, or is it just the logistics of getting these vessels really procured and built and delivered? Do Do you have any thoughts on that?
So again, my opinion on the whole situation is that there are so many gaps identified, and then there's just no comprehensive plan for it. Just having identifying the need to purchase a piece of equipment is not sufficient, right? It's a whole comprehensive plan of ensuring that you have increased satellite capacity, the vessel presence, the aircrafts, the individuals who support on the grounds. I mean, it's a whole big comprehensive plan to address all of the gaps, and it even extends to the sharing of information and making that more effective and timely. So it's about not having a plan to address all the identified gaps that have been repeatedly identified over the years.
Do you think it would be helpful if because you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but about repeating the same mistakes of the past, but would it be helpful or would it be useful if there was some sort of restructuring to kind of have one department or I get procurement might be in charge, but one kind of group responsible for that specific planning instead of every department looking at their individual needs and maybe not being able to come up with that overall comprehensive plan?
Well, I think that, our audit did demonstrate, and you've probably heard it from many other witnesses, that there are so many parties involved in the Arctic that really siloing it probably doesn't make sense. It's about doing it together and leveraging the expertise and knowledge of all involved. So, I mean, that would be the approach that I would encourage, but again, not based on a lot of the evidence, but I think having diverse views is always the best way to go about tackling an issue, but here it's more about knowing the gaps and not having the plan to deal with the gaps. So having the plan is really the best place to start.
Right, but understanding those gaps and then understanding that plan, but having, one department or one oversight of whether it's a team made up of all those different departments that is responsible for ensuring the plan is kind of created and then implemented. That's what I'm worried about with the current kind of setup.
I'm absolutely in agreement with you.
Okay.
I think it's an issue that we see across so many horizontal initiatives in the government. If you don't have one accountable party that can compel others to carry out what's needed in order to meet the objective, you will likely not meet it. So yes, having one accountable party is definitely a best practice when you're going to have multiple parties involved.
Your time has expired, and also our meeting time has expired. I just want to, first of all, thank Auditor General Karen Hogan and all the staff from the Office of the Auditor General for joining us today and providing that insight. And we really do appreciate all the work that you do on behalf of parliamentarians and on behalf of Canadians. I just want to remind all committee members that we have today an informal meeting at 3:30 in room 315 with Ihor Chernev, who is the Deputy Chairman of the Defense Committee in the Ukrainian Parliament of Nevada, and he's going to be joined by Ambassador Yulia Kovalev, who is our Ukrainian ambassador to Canada. So we'll have that meeting. I hope you all can attend. And on Tuesday, we do have a meeting with Justice Louise Arbour to talk about the Arbour report. She will be joining us, and an invitation has been extended to the minister as well, and so I'm hopeful that she'll be able to attend at that point in time. You can confirm that, Mr. Parliamentary Secretary?
I can confirm.
Okay, that's perfect. So that's our Tuesday meeting. Any other business? Seeing none, we're out of here.